And Jeff, we're ready.
So Michelle, Senior Editor, American Purpose, thank you. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. Thank you all for making time. There's a lot of knowledge and expertise in this room for an important conversation. And it's the war in the South, not the East, not the missile terrorism in the West, but in the South, and the challenge, and I would say strategic and humanitarian necessity of breaking the Black Sea blockade. Bill Kristol has kindly agreed to moderate. Eric Edelman is guest of honor. You all know both of them. So forgive me, Eric and Bill, for not giving you a long and beautiful introduction, but I think the time is best used for you all running the conversation. We're going to hear Bill and Eric in conversation for the first 25 minutes, 20 minutes Q&A with the gallery, hard stop, 4:45 Eastern. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here with all of you and many friends, and Eric, obviously. I've done several conversations on my little Conversations with Bill Kristol series with Eric, including 2 on Ukraine since the war began, I think since the war began, and the most recent 2 weeks ago, where one of the themes that Eric raised, we didn't pre-discuss this, so it was the importance of really thinking seriously about breaking the blockade and what the implications of the blockade were, and that couldn't be considered as an out of bounds kind of issue. So it's very timely now to discuss that issue in more detail, especially given today's news. Eric needs no introduction, and therefore I won't give him much of one, except I once did this with some very famous person. I won't say his name. And I said, so-and-so really was famous. I mean, really famous. Doesn't need an introduction, so I won't bother with it. And of course, he was very gracious on stage, and then afterwards rebuked me for not giving him a nice introduction, and said, never believe it when people say that they don't want to be fulsomely introduced. But Eric really doesn't want to be, right? Senior official, State Department, Defense Department, ambassador to Finland and Turkey. Very relevant since Turkey's in the news. So let's just get right to the chase. I think people on this call are very knowledgeable about the war in general, but the blockade, I mean, how much does it matter, and what could and should be done? And let's just talk about today's developments, which you might summarize as well.
Well, thank you, Bill. No rebuke forthcoming from me. And as Christine Lagarde might say, I'm really humbled to be here with this audience, many of whom have written about this subject and know more about it than I do. Just on today's developments, President Erdogan had phone calls today with President Putin and President Zelensky, and we've seen of the phone call so far, Putin and Erdogan apparently agreed to a summit to be held soon, a date unspecified as of yet. Erdogan has been quoted in the media as having told Putin that transit corridors for Ukrainian grain need to be, or grain coming out of the Black Sea need to be agreed. And this comes against backgrounding and statements, including by the Turkish defense minister in the course of the last day, that an agreement is near to working this out. So, presumably, I was going to start by talking why it's fairly urgent to open up the grain supplies for Ukraine, and I will come back to that. But presumably, if this agreement were reached, then all of this would be moot. Let me start by expressing my extreme skepticism about this Russian-Turkish negotiation. I mean, Zelensky was then informed by Erdogan about his conversation with Putin. First, the Russians, and particularly Foreign Minister Lavrov, have a long history of negotiating in bad faith. And this goes back to the war in Georgia in 2008. I see my former government colleague Stuart Levy on the call. Stuart will recall well the number of times that Lavrov lied to our then colleague Condi Rice, as well as other people. In fact, my French colleagues told me that he lied to Sarkozy so much that Sarkozy, who is much shorter than Lavrov, at one point actually picked him up by the lapels and started screaming "menteur" at him. So I'm skeptical right at the get-go. But having heard a description, and I think some people on this call may have been on a earlier Zoom today. I don't know if Bill Galston has joined us, but some of what the Russians and the Turks are talking about has been described to journalists by the Turkish officials. And some of the things they're talking about are Ukrainians providing some corridors through the mines that they've placed around Odessa to protect it from an amphibious assault by the Russians, which those who've been following the war closely will remember in the early days was something that people were very, very concerned about. And the Russians would then allow the grain to be escorted out of the Black Sea, but they would retain the right to stop and board ships to make sure that they were only carrying any other kind of contraband. One can easily imagine, given the 400,000 tons of grain, which people believe the Russians have already stolen from Ukraine, what they might put that to use for. But moreover, I'm skeptical because I think it just contradicts what it seems to me is Putin's emerging strategy. Having failed in his military strategy, Putin clearly is weaponizing food, energy, and migration, as he has in the past in Syria, in order to break the unity of the West, beggar the Ukrainian economy, and force a negotiation and settlement on terms that he deems favorable. And why he would, give that up is, I think anyone's guess when you consider the fact that the Russians have been systematically targeting Ukrainian grain storage facilities. They have lit fires now in grain fields in Zaporozhye. There is absolutely no reason to believe they actually share an interest in allowing the grain to come out. And just, to remind everybody, we're talking about 22 million tons of grain that seem to be stopped up in silos right now. I mean, Ukraine supplies 15% of world grain exports, 30% of which go to Europe, 30% to Africa, 40% to East Asia. There are $100 billion worth of goods stuck in seaports. And although the Ukrainians have, been very ingenious about trying to get things out by rail, by road, and by other sea routes through canals to the Danube, etc., they've only been able to move since February about 5 tons of the winter wheat crop, and farmers are just about to start harvesting the summer crop. So that's one of the reasons why this is urgent. And I just find it extremely difficult to believe the Russians are about to give this strategic advantage up, which seems to be core to their emerging strategy.
So assuming this is a delaying tactic, let's just say, maybe, and doesn't amount to much, what can we do and what should we do in terms of the embargo?
Yeah, so I do think it is, a delaying tactic, Bill. I think they know that Erdogan is desperate to get a deal like this, and I think that they will continue to sort of bait the trap by continuing to have negotiations, because as long as negotiations are ongoing, it will be very difficult for the Biden administration and for Western governments to really talk in earnest about some of the things that Bob Zoellick, George Will, the Wall Street editorial board, my friends Brian Clark and Peter Ruff, who I see on this call, have described in a very interesting article in Foreign Policy that I'll come back to in a minute. Hope that this can all be solved by negotiation, and as long as negotiations are going on, it will sort of freeze everything else in place. So let me stipulate first why, to be fair to the Biden administration, which it seems to me has been overly concerned about the escalation risks, both in the Black Sea, but in the conflict in general. But let me, to be fair to them, stipulate why breaking this blockade is particularly difficult. I mean, first, the access to the Montreux Straits are controlled by Turkey under the Montreux Convention, I think of 1936, if memory serves, which is a fact that Peter and Brian mentioned in their article. Second, there has been a lot of mining by the Ukrainians, and it's not even clear that were these transit corridors identified, that you could find a lot of commercial ships willing to go in because of the insurance risks. So that is another complication. There's a lot of infrastructure that's been damaged, and that's before, of course, escalation risk has been so immobilizing to the Biden administration. So, this is not an easy problem, and I don't want to suggest, that there are any easy answers to it.
Okay. So, but having said that, I mean, how urgent and important is it, for the overall effort? I guess that's would be the question for me, not being nearly as knowledgeable as almost anyone on this call. I mean, how much can Ukraine win? Can we have an acceptable outcome without ever breaking the blockade? How much has this now become a kind of an inflection point or a key kind of, what's the right term for this, in battles, they always say, a key moment where sort of center of conflict. Or culminating point or whatever in terms of who has the upper hand, both in terms of the Ukrainian economy and I guess external developments in terms of food shortages and stuff and so forth. And how much should we therefore be focused on this, or is this just one of a bunch of things and one shouldn't obsess too much about the blockade?
I think it's essential we focus on this, and I wish Frank Fukuyama was able to join us. I know he had indicated he might, because Frank's been writing about this for some time. I think that the military situation is in reasonably good shape, and the HIMARS are making a huge difference since they've arrived, and more are on the way. And the Gimlers and other munitions we've supplied clearly are having a huge effect. You can see that act by the Ukrainians. You can see it in a lot of the Russian military bloggers talking about the results, and to the point that now the government's talking about shutting down the bloggers and trying to censor them. So what worries me, though, is whether the economic situation is sustainable in the long run. At the current burn rate, the president's $40 billion drawdown authority, which is being piecemealed out militarily, but on the economic side, the Ukrainians are only able to survive because they're getting, $6, $7, $8 billion a month subvention from the West. And I worry that when the $40 billion runs out and the money set aside by the EU runs out in October, the economic attrition is going to, really be the part that is decisive here, rather necessarily than the situation on the battlefield, which will be important, of course, as well. So to build, if I could, play the role of both questioner and respondent, Lenin famously said, what is to be done? So there are a couple of, options, obviously. One is to let these Turkish-Russian negotiations play out, but for the reasons I've suggested, I don't think that would be very wise. Another is if you don't want to run some of the escalation risks that the Biden administration has, expressed its concerns about. You could do something along the lines that Peter and Brian suggest in their foreign policy article, which is to arm the Ukrainians. I mean, the naval balance is heavily tilted in the favor of Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine lost about 70% in 2014. Crimea was seized. They don't have much to speak of in terms of naval forces, but you could outfit them with MQ-1C Gray Eagle UAVs, use P-8s flying out of other NATO allied nations over the Black Sea to provide intelligence against the submarine threat, and let the Ukrainians just go after the Russian Navy. I think George Will has also suggested something kind of similar without the specificity. As Peter knows, there are some questions in DoD about the MQ-1Cs because of the technology involved and protecting it against compromise. I mean, another option would be to organize a kind of Black Sea regatta. That is to say, you get the Romanians and Bulgarians who are Black Sea littoral states and therefore have rights that others don't have in the Black Sea to organize an escort force of sorts. Another, of course, is a NATO escort mission. And my own view is if you could get the Turks to agree to it, which is a big if, of course, you could put the escalation monkey on Putin's back. I mean, in other words, this is about feeding the world. This is about making sure that the 100 million people that the World Food Program has said would be at risk of food insecurity if this isn't broken, don't starve. And, just challenge him. I don't think he wants to get into a naval fight. Seth would know better than me, but I don't think he wants to get into a naval fight with a NATO force. And I would put the escalation monkey on his back. But ultimately, what I believe, and maybe we can stop here and throw it open to people, is that the administration ought to be visibly working on all of these things. And the only thing they're visibly have been working on is the discussions of creating additional grain silos and infrastructure to take grain out by rail from Ukraine rather than by sea. I was in a conversation this morning in which Carl Bildt was a participant. He told us that when he was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, the Ukrainians said it would take them 5 years, even if you could get the rail links opened, to get the grain they have backed up now out of the country. Now, that may be an exaggeration, but it's just not, the overland is just not an acceptable outcome, I don't think. And so if I were the Biden administration, I would be visibly working on all of these things as options and letting the Russians know it in order to try and move this process forward.
And how much do you think, final question, and I'll turn it open, throw it open. You're in touch with people, actually, Defense Department, State Department, White House, within the administration, both political appointees and senior military and career types. How much do you think they're at least privately thinking along the lines you're thinking? Let me put it that way, broadly, which is not minimizing some of those obstacles and objections to doing this, but realizing this is a bridge they may have to cross, and they may have to want to cross it sooner rather than later. And how much are we having a conversation that they would find a little, outside their comfort zone?
My sense is from conversations I have had that there's a lot of admiring the problem going on, a lot of discussion of how hard this is. And I get that. I take that point. But way too much concern about the escalation risks to the point almost of paralysis.
And the escalation risk concern remains, even though, not to want you to be cavalier about it, but this has been a concern from the first day. And there were several things that were supposed to provoke escalation risks, none of which, if I'm not mistaken, really has yet. And it does seem like of all of the possible ones, like actually, for example, launching attacks into Russia, which you could say, okay, that's legit, maybe you're not legit, but it seems plausible that would be something Putin wouldn't like. This is peacefully escorting commercial vessels, selling grain to the world in a situation where there's no question, I gather, that international law will be on the side of the peaceful escorts and so forth. It seems like this is the least,
there's no legal basis for a blockade.
The least actual escalation risk of all these things. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Look, there's no legal basis for a blockade because they haven't declared war.
But also in terms of European public opinion, which is a fair thing for the administration to worry about. What if the Germans think we're just a bunch of Bush era crazy people like you and me who just looking for an excuse to broaden wars and so forth? I don't think peacefully escorting commercial vessels is really high on the list of escalation compared to taking out stuff on Russian. So as I said, stuff I've said already. So I don't know. I'm sort of surprised that this is so high on the. I guess it's hard to do, to be fair. So that's a genuine concern. But on the escalation risk side, I'm a little surprised.
It's hard to do, but the escalation risk is that you've put U.S. ships in potential harm's way. having served in the embassy in Moscow when we had bunch of the bumping incidents during the Cold War in the Black Sea, we had the Ink Sea arrangements to deal with all this. It's a hearkening back to a kind of caution from the Cold War, honestly, about not doing things that provoke potential escalation, et cetera. I think it's way overblown for the
the one thing that struck me, I will be quiet after this, is in President Biden's op-ed on MBS in the Middle East and so forth, defending the trip, he ended slightly bizarrely, which wasn't really relevant in the way to the rest of it, but someone wanted to get it in, and it was so awkwardly intruded in the piece. I figured that must be, having been in the White House speechwriting sessions, that was like from the principal or from a very senior person, right? It wasn't like the speechwriter had a fluid op-ed. And what's at the end, if you look at it, is that furthermore, I'm the first president going to the Middle East in 20 years when American combat troops are not engaged. And that's something we should never forget. I'm not paraphrasing, but it's something like that. And it struck me as very revealing of that aspect of the president's, probably his own, and maybe some of his senior team's mindset. They're not backing off on Afghanistan. I'm not saying they should apologize or anything, but they're not. There's no second thinking about that. And Biden does not. I do wonder how much the actual risk of U.S. ships being engaged is outweighing all the other more subtle, in a way, escalation risks. He is not a guy who wants to be in military exchanges apparently in his presidency, right?
I haven't done a content analysis, Bill, of administration statements, but I believe if you did, it's the president who more than anybody else has talked about what we won't do, as opposed to Lloyd Austin or Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan, for that matter.
Okay, I'm going to try to call on people. I got Michelle and Jeff to help me if I'm doing terrible things. I think Yulia should go first, since you actually mentioned Romania, and I could see that Yulia, cheered up, or maybe when you said that they could help with breaking the blockade. Anyway, Yulia.
Thank you, but I think Seth and Anna were first. I don't want to jump the line.
That's okay. That's my fault. I'll go.
Right.
We'll get to Anna and Seth after you.
All right. So thank you. I really like the idea, Ambassador, of having Romania and Bulgaria join in, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because that's not been in the public discussion at all. And basically, to contextualize that, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about Turkey's position on this. You mentioned earlier that that Erdogan is desperate to cut a deal. What we've seen from the Ukrainian side is critique is something that you alluded to in terms of the negotiations are just mostly between Turkey and Russia, and the Ukrainian position is not really taken into account. So I'm wondering to what extent you assess there's leeway from the Turkish position. That's kind of one part of the question, from the Turkish position to be more inclusive of either Ukraine or Romania, Bulgaria, other neighboring countries on the NATO side. And then more longer term, best, and I'm wondering if there's any possibility of movement on the issue of the Black Sea and the Montreux Convention. I know that Turkey has been holding it as the holy book for decades, but it's just a piece of paper, and they've used it as an excuse to not let the West into the Black Sea. And so I'm wondering, in the current context in which Turkey is kind of obliged to realize that what they've been arguing, the balance in the Black Sea, is not in their advantage, if there's any way from the US side or other Western counterparts to push Turkey to have a more pro-Western understanding or interpretation of the Montreux, or even push it aside in the longer term after election. So I'm curious if you can help us understand a little bit better what is going on in Turkey in terms of favoring Russia and looking at the Black Sea in the context of NATO. Thank you.
Well, Yulia,
I should say that sigh of Eric's is any long question on Turkey brings back the glory days of his ambassadorship to Turkey, exactly. and his wonderful dealings with the helpful Turkish government at the time,
Yeah, and my close personal relationship with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Look, I'm afraid that the Turks have zero interest in seeing Montreux revisited. They have zero interest in seeing Romania and Bulgaria play a larger part. As far as they're concerned, the Black Sea is a sort of a Russian-Turkish, zone of influence. Ukraine, they recognize as a player, but one in which they basically hope to exert influence through their ties and through their support via with the TB2 UAVs that they have sold. Although, the administration has been, I think, very conciliatory towards the Turks because they want the TB2s to continue to flow to Ukraine. The reality is Bayraktar has its own interests here. They want to be seen as a reliable supplier, and they're not going to just cut off the Ukrainians in the middle of all this. And despite occasional statements that they're going to do this or do that, Bayraktars are still showing up in Ukraine. In terms of what Bulgaria and Romania might do, I mean, Romania already has been doing quite a bit in terms of reopening the rail bridge that allows some of the grain to flow over the rail lines, and they're investing in the infrastructure, as is Ukraine. I mean, they're beginning to reopen some of the old Danube River ports that operated in the Soviet era. But this kind of infrastructure, this is a long-term project, and this is something that should probably happen. And I hope EU funds flow to this kind of infrastructure project. In the long run, it can help reduce both the stranglehold that Russia and Turkey have over this. But it's not going to get us, past October is my fear. What I do think, because they are because they're not quite as dependent on Turkey for entry and exit, because they are Black Sea states, it might be that they could organize even though they're NATO members, that as Black Sea states they could operate an escort mission that might not appear to be quote as provocative to the Russians as a NATO-led mission per se. That was my only point.
Thanks, Eric. Seth Cropsey and then Anna, combine the questions maybe, if we just take two questions at once, maybe. I think you're muted, Seth.
Thanks, Bill. I argued in a Wall Street Journal op-ed a couple of weeks ago that a naval coalition, not a NATO coalition, but a naval coalition would be is something that ought to be considered, in fact, ought to be done. And that's consistent with not asking Romania to shoulder the entire burden of this. And I think it's also consistent with Eric's excellent point about that the Biden administration is unwilling to risk escalation with the United States. A naval coalition avoids that. So I guess I have a question here which goes back to what Eric was saying, and that is, what is the possibility that an arrangement can be worked out with Turkey that would allow ships of, let's say, participating Western countries to go through the Bosphorus? I mean, that would make it more difficult for the Russians if there were, a host of countries whose ships were there to allow freedom of navigation for agricultural products leaving Ukraine.
Before we get to Anna, let me ask you, Eric. So just to put a point on Seth's excellent question. I mean, so if we get together a month from now, will there be grain coming out through the Black Sea or not?
If I had to bet now, I would say no. And I think I think the reason is that I think the Russians will be able to continue to keep this charade of negotiations going for at least another month. That's my fear. I do think, Seth, your point is an excellent one. I think what it'll take to get the Turks to play ball is at some point, getting them to understand that there's never going to be any agreement with the Russians, because they just don't really have an interest in seeing this come out. He's got an interest in keeping this going as well, even if it has no kind of actual, result. And the reason is because it keeps him at the center of attention, helps him domestically in a period of time when he wants to desperately deflect the Turkish public's attention away from, the fact that he's presiding over 80% inflation, and his poll numbers, while not nearly as bad as Biden's, are definitely not very good.
But do you think that there's any chance that Erdogan would respond favorably if there was a coalition of the naval will?
I think what would have to happen is you'd have to have a sequence of events. First, enough time elapsing with no real progress with the Russians, and then it would require, frankly, our president, to go to him with something in hand. That's one reason why I think they should be planning all these different options now, so that he can go to Erdogan with something in hand and say, look, this negotiation has failed. If we can't open the Black Sea up, the starvation, everything is going to be at least as much on you as it is on Putin. And if you want me to get F-16s out of the Congress for Turkey, this is the only way you're going to get them. Something like that.
I mean, we had our conversation 3 or 4 days before the NATO summit, and you were, I think, worried that the administration wasn't willing to get Biden personally involved enough with Erdogan and basically to pay him off and give him the meeting and pay off enough to make Sweden and Finland happen. And I guess to their credit, they kind of did it, right? And they did it pretty well, don't you think? I mean, they paid whatever price they had to pay, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe this.
In the end of the day, he stepped up. He called Erdogan, and then Erdogan got his bilat at Madrid, and managed to make himself the straw that stirs the drink. And so domestically, he stroked the audience at home, and that was his objective.
Anna, I think now you're muted. Maybe Michelle's undercutting all of you.
I don't see that Anna is muted.
Okay.
Anna?
Just bad connectivity, maybe?
Yeah, Anna, you're not muted, but we don't hear you.
Yeah, I'll come back to you in a minute. Why don't we do that? And
yeah, Anna's going to type her question into the chat.
Okay, good. Okay. Kate, do you want to ask yours while we're waiting for Anna's to come into the chat?
Sure, thank you. So my question has to do with the kind of reward side of the potential equation here. There's been some talk about the risk side, whether the risk of escalation is high or low. But on the reward side, I mean, Ambassador Edelman alluded to the fact that Russia has been trying to destroy the infrastructure, basically, that is the supply chain that moves the grain from Ukrainian farms to Ukrainian ports. Wall Street Journal has reported on the extent of the devastation to that supply chain. I'm thinking here of Nick Lambert's book on Gallipoli, where the British go in part to bring down grain prices because the Dardanelles had been closed, and then find that there's no grain there. Because the supply chain had been destroyed by the war. And so my question is, so whatever the risks of escalation are, what is going to be the actual economic impact on the price of grain, even if a blockade breaking operation were successful? And given the devastation of the supply chain, how long would that operation have to last? Because it doesn't seem like it would be a smash and grab type of thing.
Well, I'm not an economist, and I'm not an agronomist, and I don't try and play them on TV. But look, food prices in 2021 were already quite high due to extreme weather, poor harvests, and they'd been flagged by the IMF and the World Food Program as a risk. And so, you're talking about 15% of the world's grain supply going offline. I mean, this is going to have to be an ongoing operation, I think, as long as the war goes on. I mean, both to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, but also to keep people fed. So, when we did the Gulf reflagging, Seth will recall it was Operation Earnest Will, I guess, and then Praying Mantis. I mean, that went on for what, about 12 months, Seth, 18 months? I think you're looking at something at least that long, in this instance.
So it's a big commitment, for the administration. You can't just do it in this is sort of case we have. It's okay, we did that for 3 weeks, and now we move on to something else, I guess. Anna's question, then I'll come to Peter, is: are there any divisions at all within the administration with regard to risk aversion towards Russia, or is the fear of escalation virtually uniform?
I think there are some divisions. I mean, I don't think everybody is as fearful of the risks of escalation, and I think there has been a bit of a learning process since February 24th. I think there are more people now who are less risk averse than was initially the case. But any presidential administration in our country really, it starts at the top, as Bill was suggesting. And as long as the president is risk averse, whatever divisions there are in the administration are interesting, but not all that relevant, I don't think.
Peter?
Hi, thanks, and thanks for plugging the piece earlier. I would just say, as a first point on Turkey, I essentially share your views. My read, and throughout 2021, there really were two powers, two NATO countries blocking a NATO posture in the Black Sea. The one, the Germans, because they didn't want to, as Frankfurt Steinmeier, the president, used to put it, saber rattle and thereby provoke the Russians. And the other is the Turks, to keep it a Turkish-Russian lake. I was in Ankara after the war started, although a few months ago now, and I got the sense that position had really strengthened and that the Turks had little to no interest to open. The second point I would make, which pertains to another proposal, in my conversations with Bucharest, I think one of the hesitations sort of dates back to the MiG transfer imbroglio the Poles underwent in the opening days of the war. I mean, the administration seems to be positively publicly inclined toward that, but then when the Poles sought to multilateralize it by transferring through American military installations in Germany, suddenly the Americans pulled back. And so I think the Romanians took the lesson there. Anything that's going to put us at odds, potentially in a kinetic way, with the Russians, we want the Americans to be essentially involved. So I think there are limitations to anything but an American initiative. And then the third thing I would just flag, although I'm not sure how to play this, and I haven't really thought it through all that actively, but to the extent that we entertain military operational ideas for opening up the Black Sea, it will, I think, encourage and catalyze some European forces, for the same fears that President Biden apparently entertains about escalation, to support something like a Turkish-Russian negotiation, or to pursue their own diplomatic track to try to forestall or prevent or preempt any American military moves. So if they're going to escalate, let's try to push even all the more harder for a diplomatic solution. I think those the odds of a diplomatic track is virtually nil for the reasons that you outlined early on. But at least it's something to keep in mind, that any American escalatory perception in Europe is probably going to catalyze a rush to the negotiating table. Thanks.
Yeah.
Say a word about that, Eric. And while we're on Europe, I'll just, this might be the last question before your final remarks, and Jeff might want to say something, having just been Ukraine 3 weeks ago. Finland, I feel like since you were ambassador to Finland, and that's a happier story now, I think. Say a word about the Sweden-Finland accession, which I feel like is not appreciated here as much as maybe its importance may not be as appreciated as it should be. So that's Peter's question, and then say a word about Finland.
Okay. On Peter's question, I take the point, and I agree that if the administration were to start talking about more serious kind of Black Sea opening operations options, that it might catalyze a lot of diplomatic angst in Europe and people to do that. I still think it's worth doing, but I think it also needs to be accompanied by something else, which is, as the Turks and the Russians start to discuss all this, and since a lot of the pieces of it are coming out publicly, I think it's incumbent on the administration to point out, where this kind of arrangement without any Ukrainian involvement could be very damaging, so as to, forestall the Russians and Turks from coming out with something that they then try and impose on the Ukrainians, and they get to then say, if the United States has objections after the fact, you never said anything. So I think it's important to kind of begin to address what's leaking out in statements by, Defense Minister Akar and some of the Turks who are speaking about this on the record and on background to journalists. I think it really should get some comment from the administration.
Finland, Sweden.
Yeah, I was just looking at Yulia's comment about Romanian ships and reflagging. But
Right.
Yes, that's a great point. But I mean, you could reflag them as Romanian and therefore get the same benefits. And so that's something that ought to be considered for sure. On Finland and Sweden,
That'd be great if Romania suddenly has the third largest navy in the world or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Kind of bizarre side effect of this conflict. Yeah.
On Finland and Sweden, Bill, I completely agree, as you know, that people have not nearly paid enough attention to the accession of Finland and Sweden and the importance of having them join NATO. Unlike a number of the recent additions to NATO, like Montenegro and Northern Macedonia, Finland and Sweden bring to the alliance real, very serious military capability. The Finns fly 62 F-18s, which they are about to turn in for 64 F-35s that they've agreed to purchase. For a long time, they were the only non-NATO ally to have JASSM, Joint Air Surface Joint. I can't remember.
Air to surface.
Air to surface strike missile. They were the only ones outside of NATO for a long time to have that. They do have it in their inventory. They have the largest artillery force in Europe. They've got some 1,500 artillery pieces. They've got some serious defense industry, and as do the Swedes. The Swedes also fly, they fly the Gripen, which is a high-performance aircraft. So these are countries that are bringing, serious military capability. Finland never let its decline. Sweden's did decay for a number of years, but in the last several years, since 2014, they've been seriously reinvesting in defense and building their capability back up. It allows all of the Nordic area now to be a part of NATO, which for planning purposes is hugely important. For the first time now, since the accession 20 years ago of the Baltic states, there's a strategic hinterland from which they can be reinforced more easily than was the case before, when they were occupying, roughly analogously the position that Berlin had during the Cold War. It'd be very, very hard to conventionally defend them. The presence of Finland and Sweden give the NATO alliance now better access through the high north to the Arctic, which, because of climate change, is going to become an increasing cockpit of great power competition, not just with Russia, but with China as well. And honestly, the presence of Ericsson and Nokia, in Finland and Sweden, as they become part of NATO, means that you've got countries that have much more appreciation for the dangers of having ZTE and Huawei dominate in 5G. So, almost any way you look at it, Finland and Sweden entering NATO is, I think, a huge, important, and very positive shift for the alliance. So they're also very serious people, both of them, in terms of thinking about defense.
Okay, good to end on that up. Eric, thank you. This has really been informative for me, and I'm sure for everyone, and interesting and thought-provoking, and a good example of how to think through these issues in a sober and serious way. Jeff Gedman, do you want to close us up?
Hey, Bill, Kristol, I will. Thank you, Eric. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to close this up with a quick question to you, Bill, and to Eric. We were in Ukraine 2.5 weeks ago. That's me, Yulia, Dalibor, Veronica Velch, not with us today. One thing that we heard Eric and Bill frequently was the concern, takes us back to the top in your comments 45 minutes ago, Eric, the fear of transatlantic unity breaking up. And in short form, the fear went like this. You all have midterm elections and all your internal domestic politics. Vladimir Putin is very skillful at weaponizing grain, refugees, and energy. Winter is coming. And at that moment that Vladimir Putin chooses to sue for peace, this plays off something we heard from you, Peter, the Germans and French will be right there with him in some fashion. Tell us what you think the case is with a clock, because right or wrong, Ukrainians feel like they're racing a clock right now. Bill, Eric?
Eric?
Yeah, I think they are racing a clock. As I said, I think, they're going to have to sort of get the battlefield situation to a point where Russia can't continue, because I think on the economic, energy, migration fronts, their fears are exactly right. You can see how those things being weaponized by Putin will have a huge effect on Allied unity. You can see it in some of the panic already going on with Nord Stream being shut down, for repairs, and the fear that it might not be, reopened. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate concern that they have. I share it.
Yeah, and I would just add that, Tom Tukin had on one of these conversations, about 3 weeks ago, maybe, was very worried that if Ukraine didn't establish real momentum and sort of on a path to something approaching victory by October, November, things start to go the other way, certainly in terms of European energy issues and Russia's ability to turn those screws and just generally to outlast the initial flush of excitement, and support for Zelensky and for Ukraine. So I think I don't know that anything much has changed in that dynamic, which I think is one reason Eric and others have a sense of urgency about the blockade. I would say to end with a slightly glass half full or quarter full or something, what are we now in? 4.5 months into the war? It's a long time. March, April, May, June. I'm not bad at this kind of thing. Almost 5 months. I don't know. If you had told me on February 24th that we would be as reasonably strong as we've been, and that Europe would have been hanging in there as, again, reasonably well as they have, without full collapse of Germany and so forth, not to offend any of our German friends, and and others, and elections going bad in Europe because of high prices and so forth, or even here without real collapse of support in either party, and so, even though there've been some erosion, maybe a little bit. I think so far the West has hung together better than I would have expected. I guess I would just put it that way. And so maybe all the years of telling, of sort of, we don't have responsibilities in the world and nation building must begin at home and all, I feel like that may have either had less effect, or the Putin invasion of Ukraine was so shocking and Ukraine's behavior was so spectacular, honestly, that it sort of counteracted that, at least for a while. How long that lasts, obviously, I don't know.
Eric, did you have a final word?
Yeah, the last thing I was going to say is, one thing we haven't mentioned today is President Zelensky's instruction to the Ukrainian military yesterday to liberate the South. And that's, I think, quite important. They've been signaling for some time with some limited counteroffensives that they're been engaged in around Kherson, that they were looking potentially to do that, to roll back Russian gains along the southern coast. It'll be very interesting and important, I think, for them to actually accomplish that. Whether they can do it or not, I just, I don't have an answer to that.
So with that, you all, I would suggest, first of all, Michelle, thank you for putting these relevant pieces in chat by Seth and Yulia and Peter and Brian and Dalibor and Anna. It's all really good work. And so thank you all for making time. Everybody, thank you for making time. Bill, really nicely done. And like you said, thought-provoking and stimulating. And Eric, you're a great guest and conversation partner. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.